Okay, welcome everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get this thing started. My name's Peter. I work here at Amplify Arts, and it's great to have you all here for tonight's Alternate Currents panel discussion, Common Good, a primer on the commons. With our panelists, Manne, SaRena, Freet, and Amanda Huckins. They'll introduce themselves to you in just a minute, but before that, for anybody who's new to Amplify or joining us for the first time, Amplify is a nonprofit arts incubator for just and equitable futures in Omaha, Nebraska. And Alternate Currents is one of our cornerstone programs that's designed as an alternative MFA, in which cohort members work together to understand how justice in the arts is interpreted and enacted and documented. Tonight's discussion is just one in a year-long series that investigates how regenerative economies and alternative modes of exchange and value creation can bring about more just and equitable futures, not just for artists, but for everyone. And our panelists will be in conversation with each other for around 45 minutes before we open the floor to questions, but the Q&A and chat functions will be active throughout the discussion. So please feel free to chime in, share your thoughts, and ask questions anytime. I'll also mention just real quick that a video and transcript of tonight's discussion with links to additional articles will be up on the Alternate Currents blog in a couple weeks. You can find it along with a lot of other great discussions like it on our website at amplifyarts.org. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate your participation in critical discussions like this. We also want to thank the Sherwood Foundation, Nebraska Arts Council, and Nebraska Cultural Endowment, whose support makes Alternate Currents programming possible. So with that, thank you again. Happy you're all here, and I will pass it right over to Amanda.
So I'll start just introducing myself. I'm part of the Amplify Alternate Currents working group this year and am a early childhood educator, formerly worked in public schools and centers, and now am self-employed, taking care of babies. So I also have a massive interest in holding public spaces, unofficial community spaces open for community use and experimenting with non-transactional relationships and culture building. So that's a thing that I've done in the past. Currently don't have a home for that energy right now in my life, but I'm looking forward to the next one. So Manne, could you introduce yourself? And if you want to talk a little bit about how the Commons plays into your work kind of as the tail end of your introduction, that'd be awesome.
Sounds good. Hey, I'm Manne, urban planner. That's what I do, my main gig. But also very active in the arts and culture arenas. I'd say that like the Commons really ties into my work. It's like pervasive, really, from an urban planning lens when you look at how do you plan, build, develop the spaces around you. And then also I think in like the arts and creative spaces, it's about like how do you, the same thing, like, but like how do you define those spaces and give them meaning? So that's how those things, what the Commons mean to me in a broad, I guess, like overview. So yeah.
Cool. And SaRena?
Hey y'all, my name's SaRena. I run the Hot Mess. It's a bar in Lincoln. And the Commons mean a lot of things to me. I think in general, it's about being able to create a space that's free for people to exist. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it can be a physical space, sometimes it can be something more fluid than that. And I try to use the opportunity of having a physical space like a bar to be able to do different things in the community at no cost when we can.
Right. Let's see. I think that's something I kind of want to dive into with this first question. Talking, a little more deeply about how the Commons kind of plays into your work. Talking about physical space, because we know that real estate is inaccessible for many, many people. Most members of the public can't access ownership to real estate. So either of you can take this or think about it, mull on it, and we can kind of go back and forth. But SaRena, you mentioned like you have the opportunity to have this physical space, so you want to open it up. What are some ways to do that? I know Manny also probably has thoughts on this with some of the more cultural stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, at least, so I will say this, sometimes it can be complicated for people because there's alcohol in the space. And a lot of the times when we use it in some community forms, like we're not actually selling alcohol, there's just alcohol on the shelves. And so there are limitations around that, which I think is important to name, and, and that just is what it is. But when some of the things that we've done in the past is like we've hosted early, like mid-morning all ages dance parties for young people, and potlucks. That was like pre-pandemic, which was really nice. And it was just really fun to see a bunch of kids running around, and we have a bunch of games, and there's ping pong. So there's just a lot of interactive stuff for people to do. And, other than that, I like to support different artists in ways that are meaningful. So we do some fundraising for First Fridays for like Wild Learning, which is a democratic self-directed learning space. We've done things like poetry workshops and just, any kind of things. We've packaged food in the bar. We've handed out and collected items for flood reliefs. We've done, just kind of a variety of things whenever it is helpful to have one, like a physical destination for people to like drop things off if we're doing like a donation drive or collection for whatever community project needs. And then two, as also an opportunity for people to physically gather when it's called for.
Well, I guess my thoughts on the question, I thought like way more like globally in a lot of ways, like when you talk about like real estate and how that impacts how people can like access the commons or access space, right, in places. And so I think like it's who can access what, right? Like where are your commons? Where are those places where you gather? And so what's the community in the commons, right? And I think like you like just your part about like affordability is kind of like who gets which spaces, right, as well. But I also think a lot about the opening up spaces, and I think that's where like a lot of creative things happen, is those spaces that are like unused, right? Those a lot of times become those common spaces. But I do also think like to your point, SaRena, that like after we got done talking about like what do the commons mean to us, the idea of a third space also came to mind. So like bars are a third space where the community comes, or a community comes, but then like those different activities also interesting. Like I'm sure there's different communities that come together. Obviously the kids, right, like they're not there all the time. So but like the different groups that frequent those spaces, and like I also think like coffee shops, but then like what are those outdoor third spaces or common spaces, right, as well. So I don't know, just kind of, and then the affordability part, like, do you have to pay to get in? Well, or what do you have to pay to get in, or how do you contribute, right?
That kind of raises another question I had about the way that commons overlap with businesses is really interesting to me. I think in my experiences, I've like not had any idea about how to run a business or how to run a nonprofit or how to make something legitimate. So in the past, when I've participated in creating space, it's always been kind of like not up to code, kind of illegal probably, and just, people will use it anyway, because for the most part, if something seems useful, a lot of times it's left alone as long as there's no, damage being done. But I'm really interested in this idea of making it more sustainable. I love this idea of third spaces that you can they're nominally owned and operated as a certain thing, but then in the off hours, they're something else. I actually was just kind of wondering, could you describe Fabric Lab a little bit, Manny? Because I think
Yeah.
that's one of those spaces that's like, I'm sure a lot of times it's hard to describe to people what exactly it is.
Yeah, so Fabric Lab is an urban design lab and community hub, and so focuses and centers like Black spatial practitioners, so urban planners, the designers, architects, but then like expanding the idea of what that means as far as like also spatial practitioners, so everybody can influence their space, right? Whether it's creatively or the physical space, or it's being civically engaged in changing policies and all that sort of good stuff. So that's the space on 24th and Lake Street. So I'm actually moving to a new job, but that space is going to stay. And I think that's a good part to talk about with like the Commons, is like not owned by one person. Ideally, right? Like they should have like some sort of like way of sustaining themselves, or sustainability built in. But then I think of like some common spaces that don't have that, and it's all right, like a big party, and then you leave, and then it goes back to whatever. But anyway, that's what Fabric Lab generally is a urban design lab and community hub. Built out the North Omaha Trail from that space as well in the last couple of years, and then work with a lot of community partners, like whether it's to do a community event, a festival, anything that like people in the community are wanting to do. So it's a third space. It's just making that space available and accessible to people to use as well. So
I'll yeah. Oh yeah, did you have something you want to say, SaRena?
Yeah, well, I just mostly had a question. Is the Fabric Lab, is it like a nonprofit, or like what is the structure of how that?
Yep. So it's a program of a nonprofit.
Okay.
So the way it started is when I was working with this nonprofit Spark, which is here in Omaha, which I just left like 3 days ago, and I'm going to another job. So new stuff. Anyway, we acquired some buildings, did 2 of the spaces as businesses, so small and emerging business, and then a larger business to help like balance it out a little bit, because you have to like at least break even ideally. And then the third space, see, was Fabric Lab. So it was like how do we because Spark is a community development organization, so it's like how do we do community development in a way that is not extractive, and that's, if we have space and the community wants to do things, why not support the community to do those things? So that's kind of how it came together, and how it fits into like a nonprofit.
Yeah, I just as Amanda had mentioned, talking about some of the spaces that have been previously used as gathering spaces in the commons, held in common, end up being these like precarious spaces. And a lot of, I think the limitations come down to practical things like, who's going to be on a lease? Is there insurance? Is this space accessible? Is it a physically safe space? And then you kind of start running into all of these questions that are like, in a capitalist world, you can't really avoid it. Sometimes you can slide under the radar for certain things for a certain amount of time, but there is always just this bureaucratic weight kind of pushing everything down in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you mentioned that earlier, Manny, you said like, these spaces that aren't being used. And it's always, the question is always like, well, why aren't they being used? And sometimes it's because they have certain business hours. And sometimes we have all this extra vacant space because there's one of these things wrong, that it's dangerous, it's inaccessible. It's, yeah, you don't want people falling through the floor, getting like poisoned by mold or whatever. But yeah, so it's like, I feel like that's kind of, we're always kind of working. Commons exist on the margins of spaces that, I mean, if somebody wanted to be there, just, if somebody wanted to be there already, then it would have been bought and sold by a real estate agent,
Well, I hear you on that, but I think like definitely some of the, like, because before doing Fabric Lab, I've gone into spaces and utilized them and for creative reasons, right? And I think what you find is, yeah, dangerous sometimes, moldy, sometimes, but like not all the time. Sometimes it's just like a weird code thing. They're like, your doorway is too wide, you can't have this, and then that sort of thing. But then the other thing is like when places are just undervalued, right? So places like the bad part of town, right? Where whatever town you're in, wherever you're at, the bad part of town is more affordable, and there's spaces that aren't being used. Well, historically, today, who knows? Like spaces at a premium, but like I think those are the other spaces to look at. I think of like Amsterdam. I studied outside Amsterdam, and they had a whole program. It was called like the Broodplaats. That's it in Dutch, but it means like breeding place. Now, and by that they mean, like to like bring like creatives together, and then like they like create ideas. Like so, a creative place. They use breeding some reason for creative, but whatever language. But like what they would do is like whether it was an old warehouse, like your traditional like place that becomes something, or it was just like a old business space, right? Like you think see those business park areas, like those were abandoned for a while. And they just say like artists can come stay in these spaces, work out of these spaces. But then something happens. So I say it's often on those fringes, right? So like you're saying.
I think that that brings up sort of the timing and sometimes temporality of the commons, at least in like this third space and what it's held, in that sometimes they're these like really beautiful offerings of the community and they're fleeting. And sometimes they can stand for longer, you know, and there is just something about sort of the natural fluidity of life, and also just what the commons are and is, and how it's maintained and sustained and ever growing and ever present and changing forever.
That's I feel like that's a really good segue into another thing. I'm curious about your thoughts. Because I know the word prefigurative is one that comes up a lot when I'm talking with people about the commons, because, you know, especially in our culture, our society, where there's so much just private property everywhere, and it's so hard to hold on to even government maintained public property, that uh, thinking about a commons, it's not really about, and I think SaRena, you might have mentioned this in an email, it's not just about maintaining a commons, because the commons doesn't exist often. I mean, it's like creating and then constantly recreating and resecuring and protecting or rebuilding a commons. So I think there's also a lot of value in just the example that a common space provides as just an alternative to a purely transactional, purely commercial space, or a purely private, you know, residential space or something like that. So just wondering, I mean, talk about anything you want related to that, but I was kind of wondering what each of your kind of maybe like a formative experience with a common space that like made that feel important to you, like an early example in your life.
That's a tough one. No, you know what? Actually, I know one. I know one. But SaRena, you go if you have one first.
Oh, I guess I have a couple. So I think really when I first began to think about the commons and common spaces was for me during the Occupy movement here in Lincoln. And you know, it was for several months. Was an encampment on Centennial Mall. And it was really the first time that I had been a part of like physically holding a space for all sorts of conversations, all sorts of events. And that was also temporary, right?
Though
But
it
that
was
was
the longest running Occupy camp, right, in the country.
yes, it sure was. But that was a really powerful experience for me. And then I think from there, you know, Amanda, of course, was one of the main facilitators of the Commons, an actual physical space that used to exist in Lincoln. That was sort of my sort of next kind of experience that was really, really meaningful to me.
Right on. Yeah, I know Amanda had a space across the street that I liked for a while.
In Omaha, yeah.
Yeah.
Media Corps.
Yeah. My first maybe not my first, but early commons that stands out to me was like, actually, I thought of the second one just now, but the first one was like, just like when I was younger, I stayed in like kind of like this massive apartment building, right? Like pretty big. It's here in Omaha. And they had a courtyard, and then there was also like two like half courtyards on the outside. And so like there's kids in like three different courtyards. And then like the thing to do is to play hide and go seek, like throughout all the buildings. So like when I think of like the first thing of the commons, I think of that is just like kind of this like space that no one's using, but we're using it right now, you know? So that comes to mind.
Man, I love that.
Yeah.
What's the second one?
Oh, the second one was after that when I was younger. There's this bowling alley. It's on Saddle Creek now. It's like where Salving Tie and everything over there is. Before that was there, this group of kids that I played hide and go seek with. See now, like we're recording, I'm gonna get like notes from the police, like, what are you doing? Like we were younger, so I was like, this is a long, long time ago. But we for a while the bowling alley was abandoned, and so we figured out how to like have a clubhouse on the inside of the bowling alley for a while. That was the next commons, right?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see how your early experience of scoping out for a place that just nobody's paying attention to, and you can just use for a clubhouse. Like, why not?
Yeah.
A place just to be.
Well, because they're doing construction on it, and found that out. Like, yeah. But anyway.
Okay. They turned it into a church, I think. Is that the bowling alley?
Well, no, it's the like actually where Salving Tie is. Like,
Oh, that's it's like that actual space. Okay.
that used to be a bowling alley as well.
That was, oh man.
I think it
Bowling
was.
alley.
At least the top of it looked like one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay, let's see. I kind of actually want to ask you to go a little deeper, SaRena. Like, what about Occupy? Like occupying space that like nobody owns, and it's kind of legally dicey or whatever to occupy. Totally understand that. Like, what about being in that community space felt really important?
I think it was the first time that people really began to acknowledge that they could make their own decisions and that we would collectively make decisions together, right? So it's like, we sat down and we had community agreements. We discussed what behaviors were acceptable. We discussed, what it means to be in that physical space together and also just to be in community. And I think it was really powerful because I think it was the first time people really got a chance to practice it, right? So like, we think about all these ideas, we think about what it means to be in community, but like a lot of us live in more isolated ways, right? Where like not all of us get to grow up with these like beautiful courtyards that you get to play with, and so I think, especially as adults, I think people kind of lose what it means to figure stuff out together and like be unsure and make decisions and have sort of a democratic process that is meaningful. And, that I think it manifested in a lot of different ways, not only just the physical space and of course the encampment, which was important, but I think it gave people something much deeper and like, when you feel in your own being, and you're like, your wholeness, I think was really central to me.
I have no idea on that question.
Okay. Well, maybe like previous spaces. So between the bowling alley and Fabric Lab, what are some more experiences you've had, Manny?
There's a space in Gifford Park. There was a lower level of apartment building. Me and my friend Gerard moved into that space, and it was cool. Oh man! But then like there was like a leak, and it was like it's no good. Early learning experience about like property and things like that. But the study on 24th Street, like 2 buildings, got a lot of people into those. Yeah, so like those are kind of the next ones that come to mind. But I also think of like some of the spaces in Amsterdam, and it is interesting like how like what you're talking about, like that making your own rules type of thing. like that's an interesting like process, like outside of the spatial process of things, you know, like how do you govern space, right? It's essentially what it is. Um, so yeah, I don't know, and that just makes me start to think to like commons on a bigger level, like commons is like city, like what does, you know, what does that look like? That's more
Sure.
like to you all. What does that
Like
look like?
what would it look like if the city was more of a commons, you know, because they have city council meetings at times that like most people can't go, and even when you show up they really like, you know, you get 3 minutes and that's it or whatever. Maybe it's 5, I can't remember. But
Depends on the day.
yeah. So yeah, I don't know if there's a good question in that actually. Because I personally, I mean, it's a little cynical. I just don't think that we're gonna make city government into any kind of commons. But I don't know. Like, Manny, you interact with the city government more probably as an urban planner.
Yeah,
Are
and
are there places you can kind of wedge in and
well, I think it's just kind of like probably like I think of like parks in a way, kind of like that. But it's like the same thing. It's like, what are the rules we're going to have, right? Like, how are we going to live in this space together, or like occupy the space together? Not necessarily live in it, but as a city, yep,
yeah, maybe
yep,
live in it?
we're
I
all
don't know.
roommates in this weird way. But
Yeah.
like, and how are we going to like keep things, you know, functioning and not terrible? Um, so anyway, I think like the parks in a lot of ways, but like outside of that, it's tough. Like when you get to like inside spaces, it gets really tough. You know, I think that's where like the commercialization of things happens, where things are enclosed, right? So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is kind of, you know, ironic, right? Enclosure is like what the damaging and destroying of the commons is called, but yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Manny, I appreciate like them thinking more broadly because that's I also tend to go there. And I think honestly, one of the things that can't be overstated is, you know, the commons is held in community, right? And collectively. And it must be said that conflict will be there. So
Yeah.
that's always
Talk
first and
about that.
foremost. Amanda, did you see there's a
Oh yeah.
Q?
Yeah, I guess
I,
I could do that
I
now.
I think
Yeah.
that one's directed for you too.
Okay. Um, yeah, so the question says, can you talk about how the Commons was established coming out of Occupy and then establishing MediaCorp as well? Thanks. And so I feel like Occupy probably more for me just had like a like psychological impact. I was actually in Portland, Oregon when Occupy started, and there was a camp, you know, kind of downtown in like a weird like banky part of town, that got shut down fairly quickly and, you know, cordoned off, and they said they were like planting new grass or whatever, you know, cities would say. And but I mean I felt impacted by this idea that people who don't know each other already would gather in a physical space and then get to know each other and then share a lot of, you know, common aspirations and also common complaints, and that something would come out of that. So I think probably like, yeah, like there's like a spiritual kind of component of that I felt like uh so the commons in Lincoln was actually kind of like a slow kind of development from a small space in the parish projects, which I kind of like moved back to Nebraska into being involved in a little bit. That mostly was like a place where a writers group would happen on a weekly basis, and poetry readings would happen on First Fridays with art shows and other stuff. And that was kind of like in motion for years before I got back to Lincoln. But with some of those people that like ran that space and a bunch of other people who needed a bigger space, um there's just like a group of like 6 of us that were just like had our eyes out for anything that was affordable-ish, and we like came across this like ridiculously big storefront that this really old guy was going to charge us $400 a month to rent. And it had a giant basement, and it was just like I mean, magically impossible to pay $400 a month to have like an entire storefront in a neighborhood that was like the bad part of town in Lincoln that most of us lived in. So it was really convenient to go there. And it kind of, that also started as a place where there was, and maybe this is kind of, some people in Lincoln had this experience in Occupy and they brought it, you know, to the Commons, that there were like, ended up being like 20 people sitting in a room for like a couple weeks talking through like, what does conflict resolution look like here? How are we going to pay for it? It's not a lot of money, but it's too much for one person, you know? So yeah, it was kind of just like slowly a thing that became I think it was just like SaRena, you said earlier about like you have the opportunity to have a space if there's any reason you get together to get a space. And I think it was like a Buddhist meditation group, a friend of ours who wanted to have a place to play the game Go, that wasn't a coffee shop because it was really annoying to have to try to find a table to play Go at a coffee shop for like 4 hours or whatever. And like a group of people who had been previously running this like poet art space, and I needed a place to put my letterpresses. So those four kind of like interests came together, and I don't think there were actually even that many poetry readings in that space ever, but it kind of became like more important than in like 2016 when people got really upset about electoral politics and feeling like things had kind of gotten out of control and that we didn't really have very much say in what was going on, and people were trying to figure out how to impact local politics more and things like that. So I think just having like this kind of like very moldy, oh my goodness, I mopped up sewage from the basement like maybe 2 times, 3 times, and shout out to Maya and Emily for helping mop the basement with sewage on it. But yeah, no, and there was like a person who ran shows in the basement, and so I think that the biggest like learning experience that I had with that was that if you like apply yourself with some friends and community members to keeping a space, holding a space open, it will fill with things because there's no shortage of really important activities, events, connections that are waiting to be made because they can't be made anywhere else because there's no good home for them. So yeah, even if it has to be in kind of like a subpar building and for a limited amount of time, it feels important to hold those spaces open, which was the same thing with Media Corp. It kind of was just, again, needed a place to put these giant, like, 1,000-pound press part things. Was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Gifford Park in Omaha, and our landlords also owned this like totally falling apart uninhabitable house, and they're like, yeah, you can do art stuff in there, sure, whatever, just let's negotiate a price, and it was very cheap. So but the idea was that like, okay, now we have this space, let's make sure that there is a like the I feel like I've been talking for too long, but the most functional piece of either of those spaces was that there was a Google form that people could fill out. There was just a link to a Google form that we put everywhere. And if you wanted to have an event, you just filled out the Google form. And there was no money that had to change hands. If you're going to be making money, we always ask for a free will donation. But other than that, it was just like, there's a small group of people who want to use the space for regularly occurring events that are paying some of the rent. And then we're just asking whoever appreciates the space to pay whatever they feel like they want to. And that kept the Commons going for 4 years. And Media Corp was more of just like me and my partner were doing enough with the space that we really didn't have to charge rent, but we'd have like a fundraiser every year and sell art and people would donate things to it, and it was like a community event. So yeah, I think that's probably, yeah. Finding cheap crappy space is kind of like the key.
Absolutely. That's the best type of space. Well, it's not the crappy part, the cheap space.
Yeah. You can usually make it less crappy is the nice part of crappy space.
Yeah. There's some gems out there, or like, like you go to where people say everything's bad, you'll find some stuff.
Yeah. I'm wondering when we're gonna like recommon the strip malls. When are we gonna do that?
Like Oakview Mall.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we got a bunch of empty bank buildings around here, just banks for days.
Oh man, those are usually pretty sturdy. They're pretty solid.
They'd have good windows too, the banks.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it's the thing I always thought about churches too. Like, it seems like there's a lot of churches for sale often. And maybe this can kind of like bring us into this, maybe this is like the last official question we'll do before we open up to more questions from the Q&A folks. Yeah, okay, sorry. So we're talking about like there being empty buildings that, you know, we walk past and dream about what we can put in them. I don't know, what are first steps that you can imagine, just based on your experiences, for people to get together and buy a space or somehow secure a space to like open to the public? I mean, what would you do?
I mean, I think really the beginning is you just can't be afraid to make some phone calls and ask people some questions. You know, like what are they going to tell you? No. I find that to be really the best starting point.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's harder to acquire spaces than it is to just like find the space and then find a group of people to be like, let's all pay the rent or like whatever it is, right? You might find a space that you don't have to pay rent, but you have to, you know, they're like, just pay the utilities. It depends on how bad things are, right? But like to collectively purchase a space, then I feel like that's like a lot more detail because then like you have to like have contracts and lawyers and responsibilities and long-term this and that, you know. So that gets a little bit tougher, and like to do that like truly collectively, like other than just having like a LLC or a corporation or something like that, then it's even more complex, you know. So like I don't know, like collective purchasing, like it's an interesting space. That's like actually like an overlap with like you know, real estate and development and things like that. So
That's another panel. We'll have to have a whole nother panel about that.
but is it? No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do we have any more questions, Peter? Maybe not. I might get to ask some of my just like pick your brain questions.
I don't know.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess this is what we were just talking about, but how does expanding the concept of ownership figure into your thoughts and intentions for your work? I mean, are there ways that you are, you know, not even actively pursuing that, but like thinking about actively pursuing that? I know collective ownership, that's a thing that comes up anytime I've ever been to like an affordable housing discussion of any kind. People are just like, we got to have more cooperatives, and what's standing in our way, I guess. Or what are your thoughts about this just generally?
I mean, I feel like what's standing in our way on that specific, very specific, like housing cooperatives is like one, like how does that even work? Like other than just like going into it like a developer, right? But then I think it's kind of back to your point, like how do we manage the space in the commons and how do we like create those like rules? Because I think like that's like such a big part of even that concept, right? Like what are the rules? Yeah.
Yeah, and banks don't like giving you a mortgage if you don't have rules for what the thing is that you're going to buy. And yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I frequently think about what it would mean to share ownership of all sorts of things, whether it be business, homes, community centers, any type of thing. And some of the limitations that I personally have run up against is people just don't really want to take on additional responsibility. And I respect it. And I think that's okay to acknowledge what folks' boundaries are and like what your interests, and that's okay too.
Okay. There's a little kind of blurb about the tragedy of the commons, which I remember like learning about this, I don't know, maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. But this idea that like I can't remember who like came up with it, but it's this idea that any space that's held in common will eventually be completely destroyed because anybody who has access to the space will use it up because that's what people do. They're greedy and they're jerks. So I don't know, like, do you want to talk a little bit about how that's a total crack or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think instantly it just makes me think about how there is like it denies the reciprocity and like the relationship component of what it means to not only be in community with other humans, but also with like the space that you occupy, right? And also like not everything is it doesn't have to be inherently resource extractive, right? Like and that's sort of what it seems like. The well will run dry when really if everybody is contributing, the well will continue to provide.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's worth noting that, like, you know, this continent was a commons for millennia, you know, and very well managed. So, yeah.
It's like when the commons becomes, I think what it is like kind of back to that idea of like the like how the commons is usually on the fringe or like where no one can get to, or it's less valued or something like that. Is how it transitions into like just being depleted is just kind of like that increase of value in that space, right? So like, you know, any place like as it becomes more popular or more sought after, I think that's what like that depletion happens. Like I think the example is like a fishing hole, right? Like eventually like people are like, oh, there's a lot of fish over there, we're gonna take all the fish, and then there's no fish, and they're like, well, we starved to death now. So it's just kind of how do you make it sustainable? That means like either rationing something or like having that reinvestment and that reciprocity, right? So yeah, it's just without people investing in it, then it gets depleted and
Yeah.
loses value. Yeah.
And it sounds like, I mean, this has come up a couple times that like relationships with
Mhm.
the people in the community that's going to be using this space is just like, maybe that's a good first step, is like building those relationships. Because yeah, I mean, I hear that too, SaRena, that like it's a lot of work to like invent a new thing that goes against all of the values of the dominant culture, you know, or to reinvent or to rediscover, you know, and then force into existence. So it makes sense that it's a hard sell for people to like, you know, put their time into that sometimes and energy. Oh, we're kind of at the stage in this conversation where we're kind of like giving advice or providing calls to action to artists or organizers or people who are trying to establish commons. And we've talked a little bit about that. Let's see. Yeah, what besides making phone calls would you suggest if somebody specifically, let's say somebody wants to open an art space where they're gonna show just like community members art every first Friday. What are some like pointers you could give somebody who wanted to do that?
Just do it. Just like go into the space and just start doing whatever you want and see if anyone stops you.
Okay, find a space and do whatever you want. Okay, yes. Yeah.
I mean, you got to try it to find out if it's going to work or not. I mean, and I think also, I guess what I would say is sometimes I think people maybe worry about failure or when things sunset or close as if it wasn't a success. And I guess I push back against that because just because it doesn't last forever doesn't mean that it wasn't an important endeavor or that like you didn't learn something or you didn't, you know, build a beautiful offering for the community, meet some new people, do something different. Like there's a lot of lot of beauty in that. So I just don't be afraid if it doesn't work out. You can always try it again, you know?
Yeah, sweet. Okay, last question. That's just like one of my curiosity kind of questions. We were talking about third spaces and coffee shops, bars came up. Are there any other like really good that you guys have seen models, like businesses that can be paired with a community space in a sustainable way?
Specifically businesses?
Yeah. Like if there needed to be a business component to a community space in order to make it, you know, rent payable.
I can think of lots of businesses that could help with that. Not lots, a few. I think like food is something. The only hindrance and roadblock that is like code and things like that. But I'll say that's like the first thing comes to mind.
I mean, bar seems like a good one. It seems like it's like there's like a steady, yeah. Anybody have any other thoughts they want to just like throw out?
Yeah, it looks like there's one more question.
Oh, okay.
I guess
Oh,
it
yeah.
says,
Thanks for keeping track of that.
yeah, for sure. I can read it too. It
Yeah.
says, any thoughts about navigating ongoing pandemic considerations with regard to the commons?
Okay.
I personally spend a lot of time thinking about that. A lot. It occupies my brain a lot. I think one of the things in terms of that I try to consider and live is when we can be outside, we're outside. I think and then when we need to be inside, then trying to be mindful about that. I think depending on the spaces, I think it's really important to just require masks, but that's me. And also being able to do whatever you can to try to increase fresh air and other ventilation. So I know, you know, making little Corsi boxes that are filters and box fans they cost some money, but are more effective and affordable than really expensive air filters. So encouraging that, and also like practicing care in terms of like, if you're sick, you shouldn't go to events. Is I think important.
Is there a resource, SaRena, for building those box fan filters that you could share with Peter maybe, and we could put that on the page?
Definitely.
Cool. I think if there's one thing that kind of, I don't know, an experience of the pandemic that came out is it doesn't, I think we kind of all have this experience of like, you know, plans change. Things can be canceled very quickly. You can just not go to something like last minute, and that's pretty understandable at this point. I think we've all had that experience enough times that it doesn't, yeah. So like go with your gut on that one if you're not feeling good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any other parting thoughts? Definitely enjoyed being able to talk about this stuff with you guys.
Yeah, me too. This has been fun.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, no more questions. Oh, Garrett Hardin was the dude behind Tragedy of the Commons, Peter reminded me. And Eleanor Ostrom has disproved the Tragedy of the Commons. So let's see. Any events coming up for either of you guys that you'd like to publicly promote?
Not at this moment. I don't have any not at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I have any either.
Amplify's got a sweet event on the 17th of December called Grid. Should be a lot of fun. Anybody wants to grab tickets for that. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, Manne and SaRena, for talking about your experiences and yeah, bringing this subject a little more into focus for folks who signed on.
Yeah.
And thanks for everybody who showed up too.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate you both, Manne and Amanda.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys have a good night.
Yeah.
All right, see you later.